July 25, 1944, St. Gilles, Normandy. The German Panzer IV commander peered through the narrow vision slit of his turret, watching the American tank column advance across the Bocage countryside. Oberleutnant Werner Schultz had destroyed 3 Sherman tanks that morning with his long-barreled 75mm KWK 40L48 cannon, the same gun that had made Panzer IV crews feel superior to nearly every Allied tank they encountered. His crew was confident. They had heard all the intelligence reports. American tanks carried weak guns, thin armor, burned easily when penetrated. Every engagement seemed to confirm what German training had taught them about American industrial inadequacy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Then Schultz noticed something different about the lead Sherman approaching his position. The turret looked larger, bulkier. The gun barrel extending from the mantlet was noticeably longer than the stubby 75mm weapons he had been facing all morning. Before he could fully process what this meant, the American tank fired. The armor-piercing round struck his Panzer IV's turret at a range of 800 meters, punching completely through the 50mm frontal plate, detonating the ammunition stored inside. Schultz and his crew died instantly, never understanding that the weapon that killed them represented a fundamental shift in American tank armament that would transform the balance of armored warfare in Normandy. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The introduction of the 76mm gun on American Sherman tanks during Operation Cobra in late July 1944 marked a critical turning point that German tank crews were unprepared to face. For months, German tankers had grown accustomed to facing Sherman tanks armed with the medium-velocity 75mm M3 gun, a weapon that posed little threat to the frontal armor of late-model Panzer IVs with their 80mm thick hulls and could not penetrate the frontal armor of Panthers or Tigers at any practical combat range. This tactical reality had created a dangerous complacency among German armored forces, a belief that American tanks were fundamentally inferior weapons that could be engaged with confidence from frontal positions. The arrival of the 76mm armed Sherman shattered this comfortable assumption with devastating suddenness, but the story of how this new weapon reached the battlefield reveals as much about American military bureaucracy and tactical doctrine as it does about engineering capability. The 76mm gun M1 had existed since August 1942, when the Ordnance Department classified the weapon after initial testing. The gun was developed to provide American tanks with improved anti-armor capability, recognizing that German tank development would inevitably produce more heavily armored vehicles that would challenge the 75mm gun's effectiveness. The original military specifications for the M4 Sherman tank, dated September 11, 1941, had explicitly allowed for mounting numerous weapons, including larger caliber guns, demonstrating that American designers understood growth potential would be necessary as the war progressed. However, the path from design approval to combat deployment would take nearly 2 years, delayed not by technical problems but by tactical disagreements about what role tanks should play in combined arms warfare. The Ordnance Department had based the 76mm gun on the 3-inch anti-tank gun already in service, seeking to create a weapon with similar ballistics but in a lighter, less bulky package suitable for installation in tank turrets. The gun featured a .52 caliber barrel length, meaning the barrel was 52 times the diameter of the 76mm bore. This provided significantly higher muzzle velocity than the 75mm gun, translating directly into improved armor penetration. Using standard M62 armor-piercing capped ballistic cap ammunition, the 76mm gun could penetrate 125mm of rolled homogeneous armor at 100 meters range and 106mm at 1,000 meters range. By comparison, the 75mm M3 gun could penetrate only 88mm at 100 meters and 73mm at 1,000 meters. The technical specifications seemed to promise a weapon that could engage any German tank with reasonable confidence, yet American tank commanders initially rejected it. The resistance to accepting the 76mm gun into tank battalions stemmed from deeply held beliefs about tank doctrine that had been formed during the North African and early Italian campaigns. American tactical thinking divided armored warfare into distinct roles. Medium tanks like the Sherman were primarily designed for exploitation and infantry support, missions that required effective high-explosive ammunition to destroy field fortifications, machine gun nests, and other infantry targets. Tank destroyers, purpose-built vehicles with powerful guns but lighter armor, were assigned the specific mission of defeating enemy tanks. This division of labor made logical sense when planned in staff colleges, but combat reality rarely respected such neat organizational boundaries. The 75mm M3 gun carried a high-explosive round containing 1.5 pounds of TNT explosive filler, making it highly effective against infantry positions and unarmored targets. The 76mm high-explosive round contained only 0.86 pounds of explosive due to the necessity of thicker shell walls to withstand the higher chamber pressures of the more powerful gun. Tank commanders who had spent months supporting infantry attacks in the difficult terrain of Italy and Normandy valued this high-explosive capability above all else, having learned that most of their targets were not enemy tanks but rather anti-tank guns, machine gun positions, and fortified buildings. When presented with the 76mm gun in early 1944, many commanders calculated that the reduced high-explosive effectiveness outweighed any improvement in anti-armor capability. The first batch of 130 M4A1 Sherman tanks armed with 76mm guns arrived in Britain on April 10, 1944. The timing seemed perfect for the upcoming invasion of Normandy, scheduled for early June. Yet when a conference was convened to determine how these tanks would be allocated to armoured units preparing for the invasion, every single unit commander declined to accept them. Major General Hugh Gaffey of the 2nd Armoured Division, one of the most experienced armoured commanders in the European theatre, advocated strongly against deploying the 76mm Sherman to Normandy. His reasoning reflected the consensus view among armoured officers at that time. Too few tanks were available to justify the logistical complexity of supplying different ammunition types. Crews were not properly trained on the new gun system. Most importantly, the 75mm gun had proven adequate for dealing with German armour in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, successfully destroying Tiger tanks through flank attacks when necessary. General W.B. Palmer proposed that the 76mm gun be delayed entirely for tank battalions until sufficient numbers were available to equip complete units, rather than mixing different gun types within the same battalion. The suggestion made administrative sense, but ignored the tactical reality that German tank development was accelerating. On June 6, 1944, when 5 American tank battalions came ashore on Utah and Omaha beaches during the Normandy invasion, every single Sherman tank carried the 75mm gun. Not one 76mm armed Sherman participated in the largest amphibious invasion in military history, despite more than 100 of these improved tanks sitting in storage depots across England. The complacency that allowed this decision would be shattered within weeks of the invasion. As American forces pushed inland from the beaches and began encountering German armoured reserves, tank crews discovered that the tactical situation in Normandy differed fundamentally from previous theatres. The close terrain of the Norman bocage, with its ancient hedgerows and sunken lanes, forced tank engagements at shorter ranges where German guns held decisive advantages. More critically, the German armoured formations defending Normandy included significant numbers of Panther tanks, a vehicle that had not been present in substantial numbers during previous campaigns. The Panther represented a generation beyond anything American tankers had faced before. Its 75mm KWK 42L70 gun could penetrate Sherman frontal armour at ranges exceeding 2,000 metres. Its sloped frontal armour, 80mm thick at 55 degrees from vertical, was effectively impervious to the Sherman's 75mm gun at any practical combat range. Even more disconcerting for American tank crews, the late-model Panzer IV tanks that constituted the majority of German armoured strength in Normandy had been substantially upgraded since the versions encountered in North Africa 2 years earlier. The Panzer IV OSV-G and OSV-H models that American tankers faced in Normandy featured 80 mm of frontal hull armour, achieved by welding or bolting 30 mm face-hardened armour plates to the original 50 mm glacis. This increased protection transformed the Panzer IV from a tank the 75 mm gun could reliably penetrate to one that could absorb frontal hits at normal combat ranges without catastrophic damage. The turret front remained 50 mm thick, presenting a vulnerable point, but hitting a moving turret at combat ranges required considerable skill and often multiple shots. German tank commanders quickly learned to position their vehicles hull down, exposing only the turret and making frontal engagements extremely difficult for 75 mm armed Shermans. By late June, reports from frontline tank battalions painted an increasingly grim picture of tank versus tank engagements. The 75 mm gun that had seemed adequate in Italy was proving dangerously ineffective against the improved German armour encountered in Normandy. Tank crews were forced to adopt tactics that prioritized maneuver over firepower, attempting to flank German positions to achieve side or rear shots where armour was thinner. These tactics worked when terrain and tactical situation permitted, but the Bocage country severely limited maneuverability, often forcing frontal engagements that American tanks could not win. Casualties mounted steadily as German anti-tank guns and improved tank armament took their toll on American armoured units struggling to break out of the Normandy beachhead. On July 2nd, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, received formal complaints from tank commanders about the inadequacy of American tank armament against German armour. Eisenhower immediately relayed these concerns to the Ordnance Department, demanding answers about why American tanks could not effectively engage enemy armour. On July 12th, a special board was convened to determine what weapons were available that could defeat the Panther tank. The board's findings were sobering. None of the standard US tank or tank destroyer weapons could penetrate the Panther's frontal hull armour. Even the 3-inch gun mounted on the M10 tank destroyer could only penetrate the Panther's gun mantlet at point-blank range of 200 yards. The urgency of this situation finally overcame the bureaucratic resistance that had kept 76 mm Shermans out of combat. General Omar Bradley, commanding 1st U.S. Army, ordered that as many 76 mm armed Sherman tanks as possible be rushed to France immediately in preparation for Operation Cobra, the planned breakout offensive from the Normandy beachhead. 102 M4A1 tanks armed with the 76 mm gun were hastily shipped across the English Channel and distributed to armoured units of 7th Corps, which would spearhead the attack. These tanks would make their combat debut on July 25, 1944, the second day of Operation Cobra, entering battle under circumstances far different from the careful integration that commanders had wanted earlier that year. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The German perspective on American tank armament in mid-July 1944 was shaped by months of successful engagements against 75 mm armed Shermans. German tank commanders had developed well-founded confidence in their ability to destroy American tanks at ranges where return fire posed minimal threat. Intelligence reports circulated through German armoured units consistently emphasized American tanks' vulnerability, noting thin armour that could be penetrated at extended range and a tendency to burn when struck due to gasoline fuel and inadequate ammunition storage protection. These assessments were not mere propaganda. They reflected genuine advantages that German tank design provided in direct combat. The Panzer IV OSV-H, which equipped the majority of German tank companies in Normandy, mounted the 75 mm KWK-40L 48 gun, a high-velocity weapon capable of penetrating 138 mm of armour at 500 meters range using standard armour-piercing ammunition. Against the Sherman's 51 mm frontal hull armour or 76 mm frontal turret armour, This gun was devastatingly effective. German gunners could reliably penetrate Sherman armor at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters, well beyond the effective range of the 75mm American gun. This range advantage allowed German tanks to engage from positions of tactical superiority, destroying American tanks before they could close to effective firing range. Lieutenant Klaus Weber, commanding a Panzer IV in the Panzer Lehr division during the initial phase of the Normandy campaign, would later write in a captured diary about his experiences fighting American armor. His entries from mid-July 1944 reflect the confidence that German tankers felt when engaging Shermans with the 75mm gun. Weber recorded destroying 4 Sherman tanks in 3 days of fighting near St. Lo, all at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. He noted that American tanks seemed reluctant to engage in direct fire duels, preferring to call for artillery support or airstrikes rather than pressing attacks when German armor was present. This tactical caution, Weber concluded, demonstrated that American tank crews understood their weapons' inadequacy against German armor. German tactical training emphasized the importance of achieving first-shot kills in tank engagements. The crew that identified the enemy first and fired the first accurate shot typically won the engagement, regardless of other factors. German gunners trained extensively on rapid target acquisition and first-round accuracy, skills that paid dividends in the close terrain of Normandy, where engagement ranges were often determined by lines of sight through bocage gaps rather than by weapon effective range. The combination of superior optics, better crew training in gunnery, and more powerful main armament gave German tanks significant advantages in these brief, violent encounters that characterized armored warfare in the hedgerow country. The Panther tank, though present in smaller numbers than the Panzer IV, generated particular psychological impact on American tank crews who encountered it. The Panther combined the heavy armor protection of German heavy tanks with the mobility of a medium tank, creating a weapon that seemed to have no tactical weaknesses. Its sloped armor made even glancing hits likely to ricochet harmlessly away. Its powerful gun could destroy any Allied tank at extreme range. German crews assigned to Panther battalions knew they possessed a technological advantage that American forces could not match with existing equipment, and this knowledge translated into aggressive tactics that exploited the Panther's capabilities. However, German confidence in their armor superiority was about to be tested by a weapon whose existence they had not anticipated and whose capabilities would prove devastating to crews trained to expect frontal invulnerability. The 76mm gun represented more than a simple caliber increase. It embodied American industrial capacity to identify problems, develop solutions, and field improved equipment at a scale German industry could not match. Where German tank development focused on incremental improvements to existing designs constrained by production limitations, American development emphasized rapid iteration and mass production of improved variants that could be fielded quickly when tactical requirements changed. The 76mm gun M1A1, installed in the M4A1 tanks that arrived in France for Operation Cobra, featured several design improvements over the original M1 variant. The barrel length had been shortened by approximately 1 foot from the original 57 caliber design to 52 calibers, reducing weight and improving balance without significantly compromising ballistic performance. A threaded muzzle allowed installation of a muzzle brake, though early production guns arrived with protective thread caps because muzzle brake production had not yet caught up with gun production. This would create problems in dusty combat conditions where the gun blast stirred up clouds that obscured the gunner's view, but field-expedient solutions were quickly developed. The ammunition available for the 76mm gun in July 1944 included 2 primary types. The M62 armor-piercing capped ballistic cap round provided the standard anti-armor capability, with penetration performance significantly exceeding the 75mm gun against all targets. The M42 high-explosive round offered reduced blast effect compared to the 75mm high-explosive ammunition, but still provided adequate capability against soft targets and field. Fortifications. The reduced high-explosive performance that had concerned tank commanders earlier that year would prove largely irrelevant once crews began engaging German armor and discovered how effectively the new gun penetrated targets that had previously been invulnerable. The crews assigned to operate the first 76mm Shermans in combat received minimal training on the new weapon system. The urgent need to get these tanks into action for Operation Cobra meant that comprehensive crew training programs were impossible. Gunners received brief familiarization sessions on the new gun's different recoil characteristics and slightly different sight picture, but most of their education would come through actual combat experience. Loaders learned that 76mm ammunition was longer and heavier than the 75mm rounds they had been handling, requiring slightly different loading techniques. Commanders adapted to the new turret layout that accommodated the larger gun and its associated fire control equipment. July 24, 1944 brought the first attempt to launch Operation Cobra, but thick clouds over Normandy forced cancellation of most of the massive aerial bombardment that was supposed to blast a gap in German defences. Some aircraft had already dropped their bombs before the abort order reached them, resulting in tragic friendly fire casualties that killed or wounded approximately 150 American soldiers. General Bradley was furious, particularly because the bombers had approached perpendicular to the front lines rather than parallel as he had insisted, increasing the likelihood of bombs falling on American positions. The operation was postponed 24 hours, giving tank crews one more day to prepare for the assault that would either vindicate the new 76mm gun or demonstrate that American tank armament remained inadequate. July 25th dawned with improved weather conditions. At 9:40 a.m., 1,500 heavy bombers and 400 medium bombers began the largest tactical air bombardment yet attempted in support of ground forces. For over 2 hours, aircraft dropped approximately 7,000 tons of high-explosive and fragmentation bombs on a rectangular target area approximately 6 kilometers long and 3 kilometers wide, just west of St. Lo. The bombardment was intended to shatter German defences and create the conditions for a rapid breakthrough by armoured and mechanized forces waiting to exploit any gap in enemy lines. The bombing succeeded beyond expectations in some areas, while falling tragically short in others. Panzer IVs Division, defending the primary target sector, was devastated. Of approximately 50 tanks operational that morning, only 7 remained operational after the bombardment. Approximately 2,500 soldiers were killed outright by the massive explosions that transformed the Norman countryside into a moonscape of overlapping craters. Communication lines were severed. Command posts were destroyed. Survivors were left stunned and demoralized, many suffering psychological trauma that rendered them unable to fight effectively. However, the bombing also hit American positions again, killing 111 soldiers, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in action in the European theater. Once the bombing lifted, American ground forces began their advance into the devastated sector. Initial progress was frustratingly slow. The massive bomb craters that had destroyed German defenses also impeded American mobility, forcing tanks and other vehicles to navigate carefully through terrain made nearly impassable by the bombardment. German survivors, though badly shaken, still offered resistance from scattered positions. The massive dust clouds raised by the bombing obscured visibility. By the end of July 25th, the front line had advanced only 2 kilometers, far short of the breakthrough Bradley had envisioned. It was on this first day of Operation Cobra that the 76mm Shermans made their combat debut, though their impact was limited by the slow initial advance and the general confusion of the battlefield. Tank crews were still learning how to employ their new weapons effectively. Targets were often difficult to identify through the dust and smoke. The close terrain of the bocage limited engagement ranges and opportunities for the kind of long-range gunnery where the 76mm gun's advantages would be most apparent. However, several engagements that first day provided hints of what this new weapon could achieve under the right circumstances. Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell, commanding one of the new 76mm Shermans in Company A, 37th Tank Battalion, 2nd Armoured Division, encountered a Panzer IV positioned behind a hedgerow near Marigny late on July 25th. The German tank was hull down, presenting only its turret as a target at a range Mitchell estimated at approximately 700 metres. In previous engagements with his old 75mm Sherman, Mitchell would have called for artillery support or attempted to manoeuvre for a flank shot, knowing that a frontal engagement against a hull-down Panzer IV at that range was futile. With the 76mm gun, he chose to engage directly. Mitchell's first shot struck the Panzer IV's turret front slightly left of the gun mantlet. The armour-piercing round punched through the 50mm armour plate and detonated inside the turret, killing the crew instantly and touching off ammunition that blew the turret completely off the chassis. Mitchell would later report being shocked at the devastating effect of the hit, having grown accustomed to watching rounds bounce harmlessly off German armour. His entire crew was stunned by the clean kill at a range where they had expected either a ricochet or a non-penetrating hit. The psychological impact of this success was immediate. Mitchell's crew gained confidence in their weapon that translated into more aggressive tactics in subsequent engagements. July 26th brought clearer weather and renewed American attacks as commanders realized that organized German resistance had largely collapsed in the bombardment sector. Armored columns began to achieve the kind of rapid advances that had been the goal of Operation Cobra from the beginning. The 76mm Shermans, now deployed in greater numbers as more units received them, began to demonstrate their capabilities in the kind of fluid, fast-moving engagements that characterized the breakout phase. The advantage of the 76mm gun became most apparent when American tanks encountered German armour in meeting engagements where neither side held prepared positions. In these situations, the tank that could achieve a first-round penetrating hit typically won the engagement. The 76mm gun's improved penetration meant that American crews could now engage Panzer IVs with confidence at any range where they could see the target clearly enough to aim. This represented a fundamental shift in tactical calculations that had previously favoured German tanks in direct combat. Obergefreiter Friedrich Hoffmann, gunner in a Panzer IV Ausf H of the 2nd Panzer Division, survived one such engagement on July 27th and was captured shortly afterward. His account, recorded by American intelligence officers, provides the German perspective on encountering the new American gun for the first time. Hoffmann's platoon of 3 Panzer IVs was attempting to establish a blocking position near Cannassy when they encountered a column of American tanks advancing down a country road. The lead American tank, identified by Hoffmann as a Sherman, was at a range of approximately 900 meters when both sides spotted each other simultaneously. The German platoon commander ordered immediate engagement, confident that the range and frontal positioning gave his tanks a decisive advantage. Hoffmann's Panzer IV fired first, scoring a hit on the lead Sherman's frontal hull but failing to penetrate. Before they could fire a second shot, the American tank returned fire. The round struck Hoffmann's Panzer IV in the hull front, penetrating the 80mm armour and continuing through the fighting compartment. The driver was killed instantly. The commander was severely wounded. Hoffmann himself was knocked unconscious by the concussion. When he regained consciousness several minutes later, he found the tank's interior on fire and his surviving crewmates already evacuating. The other 2 Panzer IVs in his platoon had also been hit and disabled in the brief exchange. What shocked Hoffmann most, he told his interrogators, was that an American tank had penetrated his vehicle's frontal armour at what he had been trained to consider a safe range. German tactical doctrine had emphasized that Panzer IVs with 80mm frontal armour could engage Shermans from frontal positions with near impunity. The armour had been tested against captured American 75mm ammunition and had proven effectively immune at combat ranges. No intelligence briefing had warned Hoffmann or his unit that American tanks might be armed with more powerful guns. The first indication that something had changed came when his own tank was destroyed by a weapon that should not have been capable of penetrating his armour. German tank commanders throughout the Normandy sector began reporting similar experiences over the following days. Tanks that they had counted on to provide frontal protection against American gunfire were being penetrated at ranges previously considered safe. The realization spread rapidly through German armored units that Americans had fielded an improved gun, though initial intelligence reports could not determine whether this was a completely new tank type or a modification to existing Shermans. The psychological impact of this development was profound. German crews, who had grown accustomed to frontal invulnerability against 75mm armed Shermans, suddenly found themselves vulnerable to penetrating hits at extended ranges. The tactical implications were immediate and severe. German tank doctrine emphasized aggressive offensive action and bold defensive stands based on the technical superiority of their armor and armament. When that technical superiority evaporated, tactical doctrine built around it became dangerously obsolete. Tank commanders who had previously engaged American armor with confidence now approached such encounters with considerably more caution, knowing that the enemy could kill them at ranges where they had previously felt secure. This psychological shift undermined the aggressive tactics that had made German armor so effective in previous campaigns. By the end of July, Operation Cobra had achieved the breakthrough that Bradley had sought. American armored columns were racing through the gap torn in German defenses, exploiting the collapse of organized resistance and driving deep into the French interior. The 76mm Sherman had proven its worth in the crucible of combat, destroying German tanks that would have been invulnerable to the previous armament. Tank crews who had initially resisted receiving the new gun now requested it eagerly, having seen firsthand what it could achieve. The weapon that American commanders had deemed unnecessary just weeks earlier had become one of the most sought-after pieces of equipment in the armored force. German intelligence officers, attempting to understand what new weapon the Americans had deployed, conducted examinations of destroyed 76mm Shermans captured or knocked out during the fighting. Their technical assessments, documented in reports that would be captured at war's end, reveal professional military minds confronting an unwelcome reality about American industrial capacity and tactical adaptability. The Germans had assumed, based on pre-invasion intelligence, that American tank development had stagnated, that the Sherman represented the best tank American industry could produce in quantity, and that its 75mm gun would remain standard armament throughout the campaign. The appearance of a substantially more powerful gun on what appeared to be essentially the same tank chassis demonstrated that American development continued at a pace German intelligence had not anticipated. The technical analysis, conducted by German ordnance experts, determined that the 76mm gun represented a significant improvement in anti-armor capability without requiring a completely new tank design. This impressed German engineers who understood the industrial efficiency of improving existing equipment rather than designing entirely new vehicles. The reports noted that the gun appeared to be based on American anti-tank gun designs, but adapted for tank installation, a practical approach that contrasted with German tendency toward bespoke solutions for each application. The engineers calculated probable penetration performance based on examination of holes punched through captured Panzer IV armor and concluded that the weapon could defeat Panzer IV frontal armor at combat ranges, though it likely still could not reliably penetrate Panther frontal hull armor except at very close range. What German analysts could not fully appreciate, lacking access to American production data, was the scale at which these improved tanks were being manufactured and deployed. The 102 76mm Shermans that participated in the initial phase of Operation Cobra represented merely the first wave of thousands that would follow. American industry, once committed to a design change, could implement it across production lines with a speed that German industry could not match. By September 1944, new shipments of Sherman tanks arriving in France were predominantly 76mm armed variants. By January 1945, approximately 25% of Sherman tanks in Europe mounted the improved gun, with the percentage continuing to increase through the war's end. The Panzer IV, Germany's most numerous tank throughout World War II, suddenly found itself outmatched by a weapon it had previously dominated. The tactical superiority German crews had enjoyed since mid-1943, when the Panzer IV began receiving its long-barreled 75mm gun and increased frontal armor, lasted barely 13 months before American industry fielded a counter. This rapid American adaptation demonstrated an industrial flexibility that German production methods could not replicate. German tank development had focused on producing technically superior vehicles, but the long development and production cycles required meant that by the time new designs reached the battlefield, American industry had already adapted to counter them. The 76mm gun's effectiveness against Panzer IVs would be documented extensively in post-war American studies of tank combat in northwest Europe. The 3rd Armored Division, which received a substantial allocation of 76mm Shermans, and compiled engagement reports from August through September 1944, showing that 76mm armed tanks achieved kill ratios against German armor that substantially exceeded those of 75mm armed Shermans in the same time period. Of 98 tank versus tank engagements studied, American units destroyed German tanks at an average range of nearly 900 meters, ranges at which the 75mm gun would have struggled to achieve penetrating hits against frontal armor. The psychological transformation among American tank crews mirrored the decline in German confidence. Where Sherman crews had previously approached tank combat with trepidation, knowing their 75mm guns could not reliably defeat improved German armor frontally, 76mm gun crews engaged with aggressive confidence. This psychological shift translated into tactical boldness that German forces found difficult to counter. American tanks no longer needed to rely primarily on flanking maneuvers or overwhelming numerical superiority to defeat German armor. They could engage and destroy Panzer IVs in direct fire duels, fundamentally altering the tactical dynamics of armored combat. Staff Sergeant Mitchell, whose early success with the 76mm gun had been reported throughout his battalion, would go on to destroy 5 more German tanks over the following weeks, including 2 Panthers that his improved gun could engage effectively through their thinner turret and side armor, even if frontal hull penetration remained unlikely. His experience became representative of how American tankers learned to employ the new weapon. Against Panzer IVs and assault guns, frontal engagement was now tactically viable. Against Panthers and Tigers, the 76mm gun provided improved capability for flank shots and could defeat turret armor at combat ranges, a significant improvement over the 75mm gun's virtual helplessness against these heavier vehicles. The arrival of improved ammunition further enhanced the 76mm gun's capabilities. In August 1944, the first shipments of T4, later designated M93, high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition reached France. This tungsten-cored round could penetrate 170mm of armor at 500 meters, making it capable of defeating even Panther turret mantlets at combat ranges. 2,000 rounds arrived initially by air transport, demonstrating the priority Allied command placed on providing crews with ammunition that could defeat the heaviest German armor. Though supply never kept pace with demand throughout the war, with individual tanks averaging only 5 HVAP rounds by February 1945, the psychological value of having even a few rounds capable of defeating Panthers frontally was immense. German commanders, watching their armoured strength erode under the combined pressure of Allied air superiority, artillery, and now improved tank armament, faced increasingly desperate tactical situations. Panzer IV units that had been the backbone of German armoured defence found themselves unable to hold positions against American tank attacks. The loss of frontal invulnerability meant that German tanks could no longer adopt the static defensive positions that had worked effectively earlier in the campaign. Instead, they were forced into more mobile defensive tactics that played to American strengths in mobility and fuel supply, while exposing German weaknesses in both areas. The Battle of Araucourt in late September 1944 provided a dramatic demonstration of how the 76mm gun had shifted the balance of armoured combat. General George S. Patton's Third Army, initially equipped predominantly with 75mm Shermans, faced a major German armoured counterattack by 5th Panzer Army. The German attack involved substantial numbers of Panther tanks, the first time Patton's units had faced Panthers in large numbers. Initial engagements on September 19th produced heavy American casualties as 75mm armed Shermans proved unable to effectively engage Panthers frontally. Patton immediately requested maximum allocation of 76mm armed tanks, having seen the reports of their effectiveness from 1st Army units. By September 21st, enough 76mm Shermans had reached 3rd Army to significantly alter the tactical balance. In fighting around Aracourt over the following days, American tank crews using a combination of 76mm guns, superior tactical mobility, and effective artillery support destroyed approximately 200 German tanks, including significant numbers of Panthers. German losses far exceeded American tank casualties for the first time in a major engagement involving Panthers. Post-battle analysis attributed much of this success to the 76mm gun's ability to defeat Panther turret and side armor at combat ranges, forcing German tanks to adopt more cautious tactics that surrendered the initiative to American forces. The contrast between German and American approaches to tank armament development illustrates broader differences in how each nation prosecuted industrial warfare. German development emphasized technical sophistication and performance specifications, producing tanks with impressive capabilities but complex to manufacture and maintain. The Panther represented the pinnacle of this approach, a vehicle with excellent armor protection and firepower, but plagued by mechanical reliability problems and production difficulties that limited numbers available. American development emphasized practical effectiveness and production efficiency, accepting somewhat lower performance specifications in exchange for reliability and the ability to rapidly implement improvements based on combat feedback. The 76mm gun embodied this American philosophy. It was not the most powerful anti-tank weapon available. The British 17-pounder gun, mounted on the British Sherman Firefly, offered superior penetration performance against all German armor. However, the 17-pounder was larger, heavier, required more extensive turret modifications, and the British lacked production capacity to supply American forces with sufficient quantities. The American 76mm gun represented a compromise between the ideal and the achievable, a weapon that provided adequate capability against most German armor while remaining producible in the quantities American armored divisions required. German tankers who survived the Normandy campaign and subsequent fighting across France would carry memories of encountering the 76mm gun for the rest of their lives. In post-war interviews, many spoke of the shock of discovering that their Panzer IVs had lost the armor protection advantage they had relied upon. Lieutenant Hans Becker, who commanded a Panzer IV company during the retreat from Normandy, described the psychological impact in stark terms. His unit had entered the Normandy campaign with 18 tanks and fought effectively for 6 weeks, destroying numerous American tanks while suffering relatively light casualties. In late August, his company engaged what appeared to be a standard Sherman tank column near Argentan. The engagement began as Becker expected, with his tanks firing from prepared positions at American tanks advancing across open ground. The first German volleys struck several Shermans, some of which burned immediately, while others retreated behind cover. Becker anticipated that the Americans would call for artillery support or attempt flanking maneuvers, the standard response when 75mm armed Shermans faced Panzer IVs in good defensive positions. Instead, the American tanks returned fire aggressively, and Becker watched in disbelief as his platoon leader's Panzer IV exploded after being struck by a single round at approximately 1,000 meters range. Within minutes, 3 more of his tanks were destroyed by frontal hits that should not have been possible with the 75mm gun. Becker knew the Shermans carried. The surviving German tanks withdrew in confusion, abandoning positions that had seemed tactically advantageous. Becker's company was down to 7 operational tanks by nightfall, having lost more vehicles in that single engagement than in the previous 6 weeks of fighting. When he reported the encounter to his battalion commander, Becker emphasized that American tanks had destroyed his Panzer IVs with frontal hits at ranges where they had previously been safe. The battalion commander initially dismissed this as combat stress affecting Becker's judgment, but similar reports from other units soon made clear that something fundamental had changed about American tank armament. The experience of discovering unexpectedly that your armor protection is inadequate creates profound psychological trauma among armored vehicle crews. The tank, despite its many vulnerabilities, provides a psychological sense of protection through its physical bulk and armor plating. When that protection proves illusory, when shells penetrate armor that was supposed to be proof against enemy fire, crews lose the confidence necessary to fight effectively. German Panzer IV crews experiencing this for the first time in late summer 1944 faced the same psychological crisis that American Sherman crews had endured earlier in the campaign when facing Panthers and Tigers. The difference was that American industry could produce enough improved Shermans to eventually restore tactical balance, while German industry lacked the capacity to replace Panzer IV losses or field sufficient numbers of heavier tanks to maintain numerical strength. By autumn 1944, German armoured strength in the West had been shattered. The twin disasters of the Falaise Pocket in August and the subsequent headlong retreat to the German border cost the Wehrmacht hundreds of tanks destroyed or abandoned for lack of fuel. The panzer divisions that had defended Normandy were shadows of their former strength, many reduced to a handful of operational tanks and crews, so depleted that experienced veterans had to train hastily recruited replacements during brief pauses in the retreat. The arrival of the 76mm gun had contributed to this collapse by eliminating the tactical advantage German tanks had previously enjoyed, forcing them to fight on more equal terms where American superiority in numbers, artillery support, and air power could be brought to bear decisively. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.